In Chapter 9, we're going to be discussing the record-keeping requirements, talking through the reporting requirements, and also monitoring. So the record-keeping becomes a really key aspect of a good program administrator in making sure that you have all of the required records. This is to be able to document that you have served the beneficiaries you agreed to, that you've completed the project as outlined in your written agreement, and that you're maintaining compliance with all of the applicable ADFA and home requirements. Those records need to be kept in place for a defined period of time under the home requirements, and ADFA will be using those records as part of their monitoring to ensure that you are operating your program or your project according to the requirements. So the types of records that you would include in your file system, if you were running a program, so let's say you were running a homeowner rehabilitation program, those program records would include, your policies and procedures, your description of how your program was going to be operating, but would also include things like the marketing efforts that you were doing to get the word out about those projects, all the applications you're taking in, and then the inspections, income certification, all of that in the overall operation of your program. There would also be individual files for each of the households that were assisted that would be specific to each one of those projects. A project file is where we're at that specific unit or project level, and so all of the financial records, all of the other federal related things such as environmental review, the Uniform Relocation Act, labor standards, those sorts of things, along with all the information about, the construction process, showing all the inspections, the oversight that you've been doing throughout the life of that project. We talked about the CHOTA, or Community Housing Development Organizations. We talked about this issue of having to be certified and show that we had an eligible board and organizational structure and bylaws that met those requirements. So we would have documentation related to that certification, but we also would have things such as, we talked about having a formal process to receive input from the low-income community. Those CHOTA records would include evidence that that formal process was being followed, the information that was being provided by the low-income community, and how it was being provided to the board. Since the CHOTA requirements also talk about the role that that organization is going to play and the financial structure, particularly under the sponsorship role, some of those records would also be included. You mentioned under financial, and we'll talk in later sections more about that of course we would have a lot of financial transactions. Money that's being drawn down from ADFA for a particular project or unit, and then being able to track all the money coming in, the expenses being incurred and all those invoices, making sure that we could show how all those costs were related and eligible for that particular home project, and then evidence of those payments being made. That might also include, depending on the organization, might include things like procurement records, audit records as part of that process. Program administration, looking overall at how you're operating your programs, policies and procedures, all of that would be incorporated as part of your program administration requirements. And then, of course, we're going to be talking in a later module about all the other federal compliance requirements that apply to a home-funded project. That includes things like environmental review, Uniform Relocation Act, fair housing, Davis-Bacon wage rates, perhaps. All of that documentation would need to be kept in place. The home regulations require that those records be kept in place until 5 years after the completion of the affordability period. So if we have a home-funded project that is new construction rental, we're going to have a 20-year affordability period. That means we're going to have records that are going to be held for 25 years. For those tenant records, we need to keep at least the most recent 5 years worth of records. The records need to be available to ADFA, to HUD. They also would be part of a Freedom of Information request as a public record, and so you would need to be able to locate those and produce those in a timely manner. So there's a need to have a filing system set up, use some of the checklists that ADFA has put in place on what documents need to be included in your files, and those need to be audited internally from time to time to make sure that that system is being followed and that you're capturing and retaining those records as required. Some of the reports that you're going to be required to provide to ADFA would include things like the semi-annual status report. So you're going to be reporting back to ADFA in a narrative form about the status of that project, also providing financial information, and then identifying any issues or concerns so that ADFA can track the progress of your project, understand what has been accomplished, what your next steps will be, and as early as possible, identify any issues that might have an impact on your successful completion of those projects. As I mentioned, ADFA is going to be setting up your projects with HUD in the IDIS system and also reporting on who's being served. And so there are project setup and completion reports that you will be required to fill out. And that would essentially provide ADFA with the information that will need to be fed into the system or reported at the point that we are renting up units or we're selling units. We would be reporting about who those beneficiaries were, and that all becomes part of ADFA's reporting to HUD on how those funds were used, who was benefited by that. So these need to be submitted with your request for the retainage payment at project completion. You will not receive that release of the retained funds until those reports have been completed. ADFA will be using that information to enter that information into the IDIS system to report on that. You mentioned in the rental section that there are some certifications that are required. So on an annual basis, owners of rental properties will be signing a certification of continuing program compliance, which will certify that the property remains in compliance with the ongoing property standards. As part of that, ADFA is also required to review and approve rents and utilities, and so the owner will be certifying that their rents comply with the home program, providing that information to ADFA compliance within 45 days after the effective date of the rent limit. So ADFA will be providing those new rent limits to projects. You will need to then submit a schedule showing that your rents are going to be in compliance with that. ADFA will be reviewing those and then approving those, and that will maintain compliance with the home requirements. As part of the project, we'll have ongoing monitoring. And essentially, HUD is monitoring ADFA. ADFA is going to be monitoring the projects and programs that it's funding. And you, as a program administrator, will need to be monitoring your own process to make sure that you are following the correct procedures and policies, that you're collecting the information and documentation that's required, that all of the recipients are eligible based on those requirements. So keeping an eye on things like production and accountability, making sure that you're in compliance with all the requirements that go along with that funding, meeting all the requirements that are identified within your written agreement. Also evaluating how is that project doing as far as meeting the needs of the local community. Am I making an effective use of resources? And do I have good organizational performance? Part of ADFA's evaluation of you as a recipient of funding will not only making sure that this project meets those requirements, but also will be used in considering should you receive future funding. So it's really critical to have good documentation and make sure that you have good oversight over your projects. So each recipient is required to monitor their projects, ensure that they are being operated in compliance, and that's going to vary depending on the kind of project that you're undertaking. We know that we always have to have eligible occupants, that we have some timeliness requirements, there's some documentation requirements on that. And the recipients will also be monitored by ADFA's compliance staff to make sure that you are doing your due diligence at the program level and that you're in compliance with these requirements. Some of the forms that are in place to assist you in this process, there are setup and completion forms specific to each of the project types. There's also an annual owner certification form that each owner of rental properties will be utilizing to certify that that property is still meeting the property standards. There's a rent approval form that you will be completing and submitting to ADFA for review and approval. And then also reporting on your programs and your projects that are placed in service or funded during the current fiscal year. All of those forms are, again, available at the ADFA website for you to be able to utilize in the operation of your program and ensuring that you have appropriate records and oversight in place.